One foggy morning, I made the worst decision of my life. Working on the farm had always seemed like such a mundane task, but something about that old, abandoned place pulled me in. No matter how uneasy it made me feel, I had no other choice. With a heavy heart and a sense of frustration, I set off. As I walked down the road, a growing unease settled in my chest. The fences lining the path were crooked, overgrown with wild weeds. There were no birds chirping, no wind rustling through the trees, just an eerie silence, as if the whole place had been long forgotten. It felt like stepping into an old nightmare, one that I couldn't quite remember but could still feel creeping over my skin. Still, I kept going. I had no other choice. The farm's front door was slightly ajar when I arrived. The whole place looked lifeless, rusted machinery, withered crops, empty barns. But what unsettled me the most was the complete absence of life. No footprints in the dirt, no distant sounds of animals, nothing. The silence sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced myself to move forward. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. I nearly jumped when a voice broke the silence beside me. It was my boss, Gary. He greeted me with a smile, but there was something off about it, too cold, too forced. "Welcome," he said, his eyes empty and distant. He handed me a list of tasks with an unsettling calmness. "You need to get to work today. Clean the barns, water the crops." I nodded and got to work. At first, everything seemed normal, but the unease inside me only grew. As night fell, an unnatural stillness settled over the farm. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt frozen in time. I stood by the window for a long while, staring out at the unmoving landscape. No wind, no animals, no movement of any kind. It was as if the whole universe had stopped right there on that farm. The next morning, I woke up early, but something was wrong. Time wasn't moving forward. Everything was repeating itself, playing out exactly as it had the day before. Gary greeted me the same way, with the same empty smile, giving me the same instructions: clean the barns, water the crops. The words rang hollow in my ears, and all the alarm bells in my mind started going off. This wasn't normal. Time had stopped, truly stopped. Fear gripped me as I realized that only I could see the loop. Everyone else, Gary, the workers, even the farm itself, continued as if nothing was wrong. But I knew every second was repeating itself. The weight of this realization made my stomach turn. The next day, and the day after that, everything remained unchanged. The same tasks, the same faces, the same soulless repetition. Gary's presence unnerved me more and more. His expressions never changed, his words never varied, and his face, it was growing stiffer, the lines deepening like stone. He didn't seem human anymore. He was like a puppet, a shadow of something that had once been real. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I had stepped into something I wasn't meant to. One afternoon, Gary approached me again, repeating the same words he had spoken every day before. "Do you remember what you did today?" he asked. My breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed at me to run, but where could I go? There was no escape from time itself. "Yes, I cleaned," I answered, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt wrong, like they weren't really mine. His empty eyes bore into me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker behind them, something ancient and terrible. Then, I noticed something else. The farm wasn't just abandoned, it was decaying in real time. The barns, the machinery, even the sky overhead seemed to be falling apart, unraveling piece by piece. Everything, every person, every object around me moved like they were being controlled by invisible strings. It was a nightmare with no waking up. That night, I heard a sound, a rustling, whispering noise coming from inside the walls of my room. It started as a faint murmur, but it grew louder, more distinct, like voices speaking just beyond my reach. My ears rang, my vision blurred. The noise drilled into my skull, making it hard to think. "You won't escape from here." The whispering voice sent a wave of cold terror through me. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing tighter around me. My body felt heavier, as if something was draining me, pulling pieces of me away. My mind teetered on the edge of madness. The cycle, the whispers, the farm itself, it was all feeding on me, and I couldn't stop it. Days, or maybe years, passed. I lost count. Every morning I woke up, and every morning was the same. I worked, I watched, I waited, but nothing ever changed. Only I remembered. Only I knew the truth. One day I felt it. A shift, a moment of something different. When I opened my eyes that morning, Gary was already there, standing by my bed, watching me, unmoving, unblinking. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The weight of all those repeated days crushed down on me. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere left to go. I had already run out of time. And then, time ended. The farm ended. I ended. And yet, I was still there, trapped in the past, lost in the future, forever. My name is Daniel Carter, and I'm 39. Although most of my life had been spent in the city, my father's old farm estate could have been my turning point. I was never close to my father. He was a harsh and reserved man. Even while living on the farm, he kept himself isolated from people. After his passing, I considered selling the farm, but instead, I decided to stay for a while and set things in order. At first, everything was peaceful. The vast fields, the golden wheat swaying gently in the breeze, and the chirping crickets at night gave me the sense of tranquility I had been longing for. But after the first week, strange things began to happen. One night, I woke up to an odd sound coming from the barn, a soft rustling noise. At first, I assumed it was just the wind nudging the door, but something pushed me to get up and check. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside and headed toward the barn. As soon as I opened the door, I noticed the horses were restless, whinnying softly in unease. I stepped inside and scanned the area, and that's when I realized something was missing: my dog, Rusty. I had tied him up in front of the house that morning, but now he was gone. I called his name, searched the area, but there was no trace of him. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, as I walked around the house, I spotted footprints in the dirt. But they were strange, not quite human. They were larger, deeper, more defined. What unsettled me the most was that the footprints only led toward the house. There were no returning tracks, as if someone had come in the middle of the night just to watch me, and then vanished into thin air. I tried to brush it off as a prank. Maybe someone from town was trying to spook the newcomer. But that night, I found no peace either. Hoping to gather more evidence, I set up my phone to record overnight. One camera pointed at the barn, another outside the house. The next morning, as I reviewed the footage, a chill ran down my spine. At precisely 2:47 a.m., the barn door slowly creaked open. A shadowy figure emerged, standing motionless for a few seconds before stepping out of view. I swallowed hard. I replayed the footage over and over. The figure resembled a person, but its movements were unnatural, almost animalistic. I wanted to believe someone was playing a trick on me, but deep down, I knew the truth. Over the following days, things started disappearing from the farm. First, my father's old shotgun went missing. Then, one of the kitchen knives. Meanwhile, the eerie sounds at night intensified. Floorboards creaked when no one was there. Scratching noises echoed from the walls. The unease in my chest grew heavier with each passing night. Eventually, I went to the sheriff and told him everything. He listened carefully before sighing. "Your father made similar complaints back in the day," he said, "but nothing ever came of it. Maybe you're just tired, Daniel. This kind of solitude can mess with your mind." But I knew better. This wasn't fatigue. It wasn't loneliness. That night, as I walked around the property, I discovered something I hadn't noticed before. Narrow hole behind the barn. It looked like it had been dug recently, as if someone or something had crawled up from below. A wave of fear gripped me. If this hole hadn't been here before, why was it here now? More importantly, if something had come out of it, what was it? I decided I wasn't sleeping that night. I kept a large knife close by and sat awake in the dark, waiting. Around 3 a.m., I noticed the barn door slowly creaking open. My heartbeat thundered in my chest. Gripping my flashlight, I carefully stepped outside. As I reached the barn's entrance, I heard a slow, ragged breath from within. My stomach dropped. Taking a deep breath, I raised my flashlight and shone it inside. And then, I froze. A man or something resembling a man stood there. His face was caked in dirt, his eyes wild and unblinking. His fingers, bony and trembling, clutched a rusted knife. He was thin, almost skeletal, but something about him felt old. ... I stood still, too afraid to move. If I ran, what would he do? For a moment, he simply stared at me. Then, he took a slow, deep breath and backed away his gaze, never leaving mine. Without a word, he turned and slipped back into the hole, disappearing into the darkness below. That's when I understood. My father hadn't isolated himself on this farm just because he loved nature. He had known this place wasn't safe, and now I knew it too. At sunrise, I packed my things and left. I went straight to town and told the sheriff everything. He and a few men went back to the farm, but all they found was the hole behind the barn. There was no man, no missing items, but I knew the truth. That thing was still out there, watching, waiting. Maybe he had watched my father before me. Maybe he had watched others before that. And maybe, if I hadn't left when I did, I would have been next. I sold the farm and never went back to that town. But some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, and in the silence, I feel eyes watching me from the darkness. Sometimes, I step outside in the morning and see deep, oversized footprints in the dirt, just like the ones at the farm. They are always there, fresh, as if the creature had walked by during the night. I thought I was free, but it seems the thing that haunted that place has found its way to me. I moved across the country, far from the farm, but still, the fear lingers. It hides in the corners of my thoughts, lurking in the back of my mind, waiting for the right moment to surface. The worst part is, I know it's not just watching me from a distance anymore. It's closer now. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my new house, I hear the same slow, ragged breaths from the shadows, and I swear, I feel it. Its cold presence in the room with me, just like that night in the barn. I'm no longer sure where the line between reality and nightmare begins, and I know if I will ever truly escape. Because every time I think I'm safe, I find those tracks, deep and unmistakable, waiting for me outside. The thing from the farm, it's still out there, and it's not just waiting anymore, it's closing in. The night I realized it would never stop was the night I saw it in my own backyard, its bony fingers reaching out from the darkness, and I knew with a sickening certainty that it was no longer just the farm it wanted. It was me, ... And now I am the one who is being watched. My name is David Miller. I am 34, a man whose life had been taken over by the city. Endless meetings, traffic, and the monotony of the daily routine had drained me. One morning, I woke up not being able to take it anymore. While surfing on the internet, I came across a secluded farm that was up for sale in a rural area of Wyoming. I was mesmerized by the pictures. Rolling fields, an old but sturdy house at the edge of a forest. Something stirred inside me. This property could be my chance to rediscover myself. Buying the farm was a new start. The first few days were days of optimism. I'd wake up to birdsong, sip my coffee on the porch, and gaze at the endless green for hours. But in the quiet, there was something that didn't sit right. As if I wasn't alone. That first night, sleep eluded me. The wind rattled the old wooden walls, and the floorboards creaked under no one's feet. It's an old house, I said to myself. These are normal noises. But around midnight, I heard something else, footsteps in the house. I walked in the direction of the sound. Upstairs, in the dancing shadows, I could have sworn I saw movement. My heart was racing. I grabbed my flashlight and shone its light into the darkness. Nothing. I attributed it to fatigue and returned to bed. But sleep did not come back. Behind the farmhouse stood an ancient barn, its weathered wood and squeaky, corroded hinges appearing to share whispers from the past. I visited it one morning, flashlight in hand. Everything inside was discarded. Busted tools, a chair in the corner shrouded in dust. But the walls stopped me cold. Marks, deep, deliberate gouges in the wood. Some were dates 1998, 2005, and more. Amidst them, one foreboding word, "Don't return." A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe kids messing around, I thought. But something about those markings unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. Things were never the same from that night. The house no longer felt like a refuge. I began to hear noises from deep within the fields, rustling leaves, faint whispers in the wind. I could have sworn that I heard a scream in the distance one time. Then, one night, I was awakened by a tapping sound. It was at my bedroom window. I rolled over and looked at it, and there was the outline of something or someone pressed against the window pane. My heart pounding, I reached for my flashlight and focused it on the window. Nothing. But the next morning, the ground beneath the window was disturbed, as if someone had been standing there. Footprints, thin footprints. I was drinking my coffee one morning when I noticed a dark figure at the far end of the field. He was looking at me. I figured he was a neighbor at first, but when I approached, he didn't move. I yelled, no response. I blinked, and he was gone. Just like that. One night, the entire farm was plunged into darkness. The electricity had failed. The silence was deafening and made every creak and rustle sound loud. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check the main breaker. That's when I heard a metal scraping sound over at the tree line. I paused and listened. It sounded like chains were being pulled along the ground. I yanked my flashlight in the direction of the trees. I held my breath. A figure in a hood was standing there, watching. His face was obscured in the shadows. I freaked out and ran indoors, locking all the doors behind me. I installed security cameras around the house after that night. There was nothing unusual on the footage for the first few nights. But then, one morning, as I was reviewing the recordings, I saw him. A masked man, standing at the rear of the house, staring directly into the camera. He had something in his hands, but I couldn't make out what it was. I phoned the police. They looked at the footage but brushed it aside, saying blurry images like this were typical of rural places. Their attitude was less than reassuring. I was not going to let it go, so I devised a plan. I stayed up that night, gun in hand, waiting. Around midnight, I heard some noises in the barn. I turned off the lights and crept out. I shoved the barn door open and my heart rate accelerated. Someone was inside. My flashlight illuminated a figure who stood within the darkness. He turned to face me, his eyes wild. A knife glinted in his hand. I lifted my gun, focusing on him, my hands shaking. He let out a dreadful laugh. "You can't make me leave," he whispered. A wave of pure fear swept over me. My finger quivered on the trigger, but before I could act, he backed into the darkness of the barn. I could not bring myself to follow. That was the breaking point. I packed my belongings and left that night, seeking refuge in a nearby motel. The police claimed they would investigate, but no concrete explanation was available. Later, I found out that there was a sinister past to the farm. Transients had called it home over the years, hiding in the shadows, watching, waiting. I had been just another unsuspecting visitor in their territory. I no longer trust the quiet. Silence is not necessarily peaceful. It's the kind of nothingness wherein darkness resides, just out of sight.